Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to our Bible Study with Me series going through the book of Habakkuk. Today's video we're going to be in Habakkuk chapter 3, which is the final chapter in this book. It has been so good. There's been so much I've learned about this book that I didn't know before. If you haven't already, make sure you go back and watch the videos we already did on chapters 1 and 2 so you can understand what's been happening, the conversation that's been taking place between Habakkuk and God, and understand the point that we are now being brought to in chapter 3, where Habakkuk arrives at this place of peace after wrestling with God. So, brief recap on what we have studied so far. Once again, Habakkuk is a minor prophet, and this book records this dialogue that he is having, this personal conversation with God that lets us into this personal struggle that Habakkuk is having of, if God is in control, then why does so much evil exist, and why does he not seem to be doing anything about it? In chapter 1, we saw Habakkuk's first complaint where he says, God, why are you not doing anything to judge Judah? And then we see God's answer to this first complaint of saying, I am doing something. I am raising up Babylon to judge Judah. And then we also see in chapter 1 Habakkuk's second complaint where he's saying, well, why are you doing it that way? Why are you judging Judah by raising up even more wicked Babylon? In chapter 2, we see God's response to these complaints that Habakkuk raises. And in God's response, he actually doesn't directly answer the question of why. We talked in chapter 2 about how life is going to be full of unanswered questions, and we can either torment ourselves with the unanswered whys, or we can believe that God is fundamentally good and we can trust him even when things do not make sense to us. And so even though God doesn't answer the why question of why he is using the Babylonians as his instrument of judgment on Judah, he does affirm that he is not going to leave Babylon unpunished. And so that's what we talked through in chapter 2, where God gives these 5 woes of basically saying, I'm not going to tell you why I'm doing this, but rest assured that Babylon isn't going to go unpunished. And he points out these 5 areas of injustice where Babylon is in the wrong and the resulting judgment that will come from that. And once again, in the beginning of chapter 2, God says, write this down. What I am about to tell you of the coming justice I will bring to Babylon, write it down because it's not going to happen immediately. And maybe you're going to be encouraged in this conversation where I tell you that I'm going to do this, but there's going to be a stretch where it's not going to seem like I'm doing anything. It's going to seem like I'm allowing injustice to go unpunished, but hold on, write down the things I'm going to tell you. Rest assured that justice will be brought one day. And so now here in chapter 3, we have Habakkuk's response, and it is broken out into 2 different parts. Again, it's just one monologue, just like we had from God in chapter 2, but it is broken out into 2 subheadings. The first is Habakkuk's prayer. The second is Habakkuk rejoices in the Lord. And so this is the part of the story that we talked about in chapter 1, where Habakkuk arrives at this place of peace in knowing God's character firmly after wrestling through the tough questions. And again, we talked about in chapter 1 how this is actually reflected in his name, because the name Habakkuk literally means he who embraces or he who clings. And so we see Habakkuk arrive at this place of firm faith after wrestling through the tough questions. He now has this firm grip on and understanding of and trust in God's character through the wrestling that he has gone through. And so how we're going to structure this video is similar to how we structured the chapter 2 video. I'm going to read through the entire chapter because once again, this is just one long thing that Habakkuk says. And then we're going to stop and go back through and talk through and unpack what Habakkuk is saying. And we'll kind of break that up into the 2 subheadings. So Habakkuk's prayer and then Habakkuk rejoices in the Lord. So again, read through it all, go back through and talk through it all. And then as always, pick a verse to zoom into and do a little bit deeper study. As always, any of the sermons I reference, commentaries, study Bibles, Bible, all of that is going to be linked below. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and pull it out and turn to Habakkuk chapter 3. Verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shiggaion Noth. We're just gonna hope that we said that right. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light, rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth, he looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains you saw and wreathed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place. At the light of your arrows they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. All right, so let's unpack what's going on here. I want to start with that first subheading, which is again Habakkuk's prayer. This covers the bulk of chapter 3, so it covers verse 1 through 16, and there's 19 verses in the chapter. And so essentially what's happening here, because you kind of read through it and you go, what is being said here? It's talking about God's splendor covering the heavens. It's talking about how before him went pestilence, and there's a plague following at his heels. How he's measuring the earth. It's talking about Cushan and Midian and God's wrath against the rivers and stripping the sheath from his bow, calling for arrows, how the mountains saw God and wreathed and the raging waters swept on, how the sun and moon stood still. So there's all these things, all this imagery and all these declarations of what God has done or what has happened. And so essentially what is happening here in Habakkuk's prayer is that Habakkuk is recalling past displays of God's power and wrath. And so there's a lot of sort of references to different Old Testament stories going on in this part of the chapter. And I want to break that down with some of the notes in my study Bible. And so the first thing is a note about this subheading as a whole, about Habakkuk's prayer. And it says that Habakkuk asks for a demonstration of God's wrath and mercy, such as God demonstrated so powerfully in the past. And so he's basically saying, God, look at all these ways you moved and you displayed your power and your wrath in the past, and he's appealing to that and then saying, God, do it again. And then he closes with a confession of faith, and that's what we're going to get into in the next subheading, a confession of faith and trust in God. Let's talk about that word that I'm not sure if I said right, the shigianoth. So the note here in the commentary says that this word only occurs twice in the Old Testament, once in singular and once in plural, and it may refer to an instrument or type of psalm. And so it's saying a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to this psalm or this instrument. So let's break out and break down all the different ways that Habakkuk is referring to God's past shows of power and wrath. So first in verse 2, which says, O Lord, I have heard a report of you. All of these stories of how you've moved and how you've worked in the past, it's been passed down to me. We've been telling and sharing them for all of these years. So I have heard this report of you, and I fear your work. Habakkuk is saying, I fear you, God. I know what you've done. I know how you have moved in the past. My note from the commentary says Habakkuk had heard, perhaps in the temple, of God's great saving acts, which he then goes on to recount in verses 3 through 15. But before he does that, he makes this plea in chapter 2 of saying, in the midst of wrath, remember mercy. And so here's this plea that Habakkuk gives of God, when you judge, also be merciful. And this is a classic statement, the commentary says, on how God deals with his people, that there is wrath, but there's also mercy. So let's kind of comb through these verses. In verse 3, it talks about God coming from Teman and the Holy One from Paran. And so this is suggesting the time following Israel's exodus from Egypt. And so it's just referring to who he is and what he has already brought the people through. Verses 4 through 5 talks about his brightness being like the light and these rays flashing from his hand. And so the note from the commentary here says that Habakkuk is likening God's presence at Mount Sinai when he comes and gives the law to Moses to that of a thunderstorm with darkness and flashes of lightning. So this is just a picture of God's majesty, his splendor. And then verse 5 talks about how before him went pestilence and plague followed at his heels. And so these are often pictures of divine judgment. We see that in the Exodus story when God brings these 10 plagues on the Egyptians. Verse 6 talks about how God stood and measured the earth. This makes me think of Job when God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And it says here also as well that he looked and shook the nations, the eternal mountains were scattered. So mountains, it says here in my study Bible, were considered part of the foundation of the earth, and thus their quaking was a sign of divine judgment. So once again, this is Habakkuk pointing back to a picture or a display of God's judgment. And then earthquakes, which the verse goes on to talk about, likewise are frequently associated with God's power. When Habakkuk refers to Cushan and Midian in verse 7, these are Arab tribes that would have been living near Edom. And when they see God's power in stories that are referenced here in Exodus 15 and Joshua 2, they're stricken with fear. So again, this is just rife with all of these pictures are pointing back to what God has already done in the Old Testament books that have already happened. Then in verse 8, where it talks about the wrath being against rivers and against seas and all of that, this is referring to God's power over the Nile, again in the 10 plagues, and then also the Jordan River as well as the Red Sea, which God split so that the Israelites could walk through on dry ground. And so it's here saying that these are these majestic displays of God's power. But Habakkuk is asking the question, was your wrath against the rivers? No, you were simply splitting them or parting these seas so that you could deliver and ultimately save your people. Jumping down to verse 11, where it's talking about the sun and the moon stood still. This is a reference to Joshua's victory at Gibia in the story found in Joshua 10. And so the commentary note here says that victory here will be equally sensational. And so this is a story where God literally has the sun and the moon stand still so that Joshua and his army could keep fighting and gain victory at Gibia. So this picture again of God's power, that he is in control of the sun, the moon, the universe. And Habakkuk is appealing to this. So once again, all throughout this prayer of Habakkuk, we see pictures of how God has moved in the past, his power and his wrath. And then we get to verse 16, the final verse in this first subheading. And Habakkuk says, I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters my bones, my legs tremble beneath me, yet I will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. And so my note here says, Habakkuk realizes that he must patiently wait for the destruction of his people, and that God will then unleash his power against the Babylonians, the people who invade us. And so he is waiting first for that judgment against Judah, his own people, and then God is going to unleash his power, his wrath that we've seen all throughout the Old Testament against the Babylonians. And Habakkuk is going to have to wait for this. One of the things I love about this prayer of Habakkuk is that in his prayer, he was literally able to just rattle off and repeat back to God all of these moves of God that had happened in the past. And in order for him to do that, he had to have them stored in his heart. He had to know them. He had to know the stories of how God had moved. A similar thing happens in Acts chapter 7, I believe it is, when Stephen, the first martyr, is going before the council, and he basically repeats all these stories of how God has moved in the past. And it says that his face shone like the face of an angel. And I can't help but wonder if that was because he had stored these stories of who God is and how he had moved into his heart to the point that he was able to just repeat them back. And Habakkuk here does the same thing. He repeats back to God in prayer who God is, how God has moved in the past, and in that appeals to God to move again. And we see that all throughout the Old Testament, that God commands us, and in the Psalms as well, and really all throughout the Bible, God commands us to remember the things that he did. And God doesn't tell us to remember the things he did just so that we can remember the things he did, but God wants us to remember the things he did because they tell us something about who he is. And when we can remember what God did, we are reoriented to the character of who he is, and so that we can trust he is going to do it again. And Habakkuk and the people in his time are going to need this, because once again, this judgment or this vindication against the injustices of Babylon is not going to come immediately. There's going to be a time where it seems like God isn't moving, where he's not doing anything. And so in that dark time, they're going to have to be calling to mind what God has done in the past to remind themselves of who God is and know that he is going to, one, remain true to his word, and two, he is going to do it again. I also think it's important to note from verse 2, where it says, in the midst of years, revive it, that Habakkuk is praying also for revival, that through the judgment, that the people would ultimately come to know God. And we talked about this in chapter 1, how God is using the Babylonians to bring judgment to Judah, but ultimately this is done from a place of love, that he is choosing to discipline and correct the people that he loves, because after Babylon is done with them, they are going to be crying out to God, turning to know God. And so Habakkuk is praying for this, basically saying, use this judgment, use this difficult time that is coming for the people of Israel to bring them to know you more. One note from the Enduring Word Commentary says, the prayer of Habakkuk shows us that revival is a work of God, not the achievement of man. There is something man can and must do for revival. Simply cry out to God and plead for his work. And this is what Habakkuk is doing. One more note on verse 16, where it says, my body trembles. Again, from the Enduring Word Commentary, it says that Habakkuk showed here in saying my body trembles a proper response of man under the sovereign power of God. He recognized his own weakness and low standing before this God of all majesty and power. And it's this idea that when we see God correctly, we see ourselves correctly in light of that. We see our standing before him. We are humbled. We are in a holy reverence and fear and awe of who God is. Moving on now to the second subheading. Again, this is Habakkuk rejoices in the Lord, and it's verses 17 through 19. So really just that tail end of the chapter and also the book. And so here's where Habakkuk is essentially talking about how all these different things are not producing life or fruit. So he's talking about the fig tree, how it's not blossoming, though there is not fruit on the vines, or the produce of the olive tree fails, and the fields yield no food, the flock is cut off from the fold, there is no herd in the stalls. So all of this bad stuff is happening. There's no fruit, no life from these things, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. And so a note here from my study Bible says that Habakkuk is anticipating great destruction at the hands of the Babylonians, but his attitude has radically changed. He began this book by informing God how to run his world and ended by trusting that God knows best and will bring about justice. And so that section we just ran through about all these things not bringing fruit or life, here it's saying that it is a frequently quoted list of material disasters in which all crops and livestock are lost, and as a result, it is unclear how there will be food to eat. Yet even amidst suffering and loss, Habakkuk has learned that he can trust God, and with that trust comes great joy, not in circumstances, but in God himself. And so saying, even though all these things are bad, even though it's unclear where our provision is going to come from, I can trust in God, not because of my circumstances, but because of who he is. He says, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord is my strength, not my circumstances, not how things are going, but God himself is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's feet. He makes me tread on high places. A note of this says Habakkuk can have sure-footed confidence, like the sure-footedness of a deer, in God and live on the heights even amid extreme circumstances. And this is actually the verse I want to look at and dig a little bit deeper into, because there's really just such rich truth and imagery in it. If you've heard of the book Hind's Feet on High Places, this is one of the verses it comes from, along with a similar verse in the Psalms, I believe. So we'll go ahead and study that a little bit more in depth. I'm going to pull out my Scribe Bible journal and we'll dig in. All right, so here's those verses. Once again, it's Habakkuk 3:18 through 19, and it says, Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. So the first thing I notice about this verse is that joy is not contingent on circumstances, because once again, Habakkuk is in the middle of waiting for this judgment, waiting for the Babylonians to come and for this conquest to happen. Yet, like it says, he is rejoicing in the Lord. He is taking joy in the God of his salvation. So I put joy is not contingent on circumstances, but on the unchanging character of God. This also makes me think of that verse from Nehemiah. I believe it's somewhere in Nehemiah verse 8, where it says, the joy of the Lord is your strength. Let's just see if we can find that. Okay, so here we are, it's verse 10. It says, the joy of the Lord is your strength. So I'm just gonna make a little note designating that echoes what is said in Nehemiah 8:10. Okay, next I want to read a note from the Enduring Word commentary app on this analogy of the deer, where Habakkuk is saying that he, God, makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And so here's the note right here. It says, Habakkuk thought of the deer running about on high hills, never losing a step and never falling. More than that, the deer positively dance and leap on the hills. They are full of life and joy. So the prophet proclaimed, God will set my steps that firmly and lively also. As I trust in him, he will not allow me to slip or fall, and I will do more than merely plod along. I will skip about with life and joy. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that first part from the commentary. Okay, so I copied that note again. It says, Habakkuk thought of the deer running about on the high hills, never losing a step and never falling. More than that, the deer positively dance and leap on the hills. They are full of life and joy. I'm just gonna kind of process through and write that out in my own words to deepen my understanding of it. Okay, so here's what I wrote. When our trust is firmly rooted in God's character and promises, then even in challenging times, we can not only be sure-footed and stable, but also joyful. I'm gonna highlight that. And just to kind of break down where I got this, so again, it's talking about having that trust in God and even in challenging times. So when it talks about the high hills that the deer are on, that refers to this rocky, rugged, potentially dangerous terrain, yet the deer has sure footing because of the way their hooves are designed. And so they still, even on those high hills, they don't lose a step and they don't fall. But then they also dance positively and leap on the hills. They're full of life and joy. And so even in those challenging times, those high hills, we can not only be sure-footed and stable, but also joyful. So we are not going to be tossed to and fro by our circumstances, but we can be steady and stable as we rest in God's character and promises, and we can also have joy. So I'm just going to make some notes breaking apart those things. Okay, so I just added that note about the high hills, that they refer to rugged, potentially dangerous terrain, and then being sure-footed, that we don't have to be tossed to and fro by our circumstances, but we can steadily anchor ourselves in the unchanging character and promises of God. So one more time on that big idea, when our trust is firmly rooted in God's character and promises, then even in challenging times, we can not only be sure-footed and stable, but also joyful. So I love this progression we have in the book of Habakkuk, where we see him in the beginning saying, "How long, God, and why are you not acting?" to then having this encounter with God, this conversation, being in the presence of God and being reminded of who he is, being brought to this appropriate place of awe and reverence toward God, where he can now have this inner peace in resting and trusting in the character of God, even when his circumstances haven't changed. And he's given this hope that God will ultimately act, that God will ultimately bring justice. But the interesting thing here now is that Habakkuk is essentially having to come back down from this mountaintop experience, this encounter with God, back down to the valley, and he's now having to wait for what was spoken, even though nothing has currently changed. We talked about this in chapter 2 as well, how oftentimes when God speaks something, we don't see the fulfillment of it right away, and we have to remind ourselves of what he's spoken, even when our circumstances are tempting us to distrust his character, to distrust what he has spoken. But again, what God has spoken will come to pass, and his character is unchanging. We can rest in that. That is all for Habakkuk chapter 3 and for this Bible Study with Me series through the book of Habakkuk. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned from it. Don't forget to leave a comment down below letting me know what verse stood out to you most from chapter 3 or something you took away from it, and then also read through the other comments and engage with those as well. If you enjoyed this study series and would like to see me do more, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and then also hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and then leave a comment down below with some ideas of what book you might like to see me do next. Thank you so much for watching this video and this series, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.